The pandemic and its economic fallout have been especially tough on public transportation. In response to a drop in ridership and revenue, officials say they'll have to make cuts in service. But transportation advocates say that could also make things worse for public health and economic recovery. Joining us are two of those advocates, the Executive Director of TransitMatters, Jared Johnson, and the Associate Executive Director of GreenRoots, Inc. in Chelsea, Maria Belen Power. Thank you both very much for being with us.
Of course.
I'd like to start with Jared because I know everybody's focused on what's happening right now, and we know the pandemic makes things very unusual, but why is the concern here that temporary adjustments could have permanent consequences?
Well, I think even to push back on the word temporary, I mean, the T has said that service cuts are going to be permanent. And some of this is because they were already undergoing the process of looking at the network and sort of looking at different routes and where they should go, because the network hasn't been designed or hasn't been redesigned in some time. But also because when you mothball commuter rail trains, or whenever you fire or lay off skilled mechanics and electricians for some of these very niche things that the T does, it takes a very long time, in order to spin the T back up. And so that's why we're really, really concerned about this. And, we're also concerned because, we just feel that this, that these cuts are being made, prematurely, that we don't know what, the situation changes from month to month. And so making such drastic changes, this could have long-term impacts, not just for transit riders, but for our economic recovery, for access to healthcare and education.
But by the way, Jared, talk about that timing a little bit, because there are these other factors that have to be considered. You've got the state legislature and Congress, the election results, whenever we figure those out. How do those affect the T?
Yeah, I definitely understand, some of the T's, urgency, and that, it does take, it takes 6, or so months to make these big service changes. But at the same time, because we're still waiting on, because we'll still be waiting on, election results, we don't think that they're likely to get, any kind of, package through until the new Congress is gavelled in shortly after the new year. And so, we really think that we should be waiting to see, what happens there, and that we should be also really pushing the legislature to act now, because, even if the federal government is able to give support, we've known that even before COVID, that we've had that we've had an issue with having enough operating dollars for the T.
Attorney Maria Belen Power, what do you see right now in Chelsea as far as all those people who need to ride buses to work, for example?
What we see now is what we've always seen, which is a vast majority of Chelsea residents having to rely on public transit and having no other option. The vast majority of our folks, they don't own cars, they work outside of Chelsea, and they rely on the buses. And so we saw during COVID, the reduction of service because of the pandemic, and folks were still needing to use the service. And so folks that use the buses, you could see the reduction in ridership went down, but not in buses, not in Chelsea, not in East Boston, not where the essential workers lived. And so we know that 80% of the employees in Chelsea were considered essential workers. And so our folks back then, pre-COVID, exacerbated during COVID, and now are using the T, are relying on the buses, and it's a lifeline for our communities.
Well, if there is crowding on these buses, it would seem to be the most predictable kind, when people go to work. But what about the T's commitment to relieving that, maybe making adjustments to have more buses available? Do you see some evidence that's happening so far?
We do have to celebrate that the MBTA has added buses on some lines, has added service on some bus lines in Chelsea. And so there's been an addition for the 112 and for the 111. There have also been additions during COVID when we expressed concerns of overcrowdedness, because we know that the term overcrowdedness pre-COVID and post-COVID have very different meanings. And so the fear of infection rates in the buses is a very real one. So there were some buses that were sort of reinstated and added, and they were added altogether for routes like the 112. We worry that what this president said, that the precedents that we're setting of cuts being done and of pitting communities versus each other and of pitting modes versus each other, like buses versus commuter rail versus train, because we know our folks, they don't just take a bus, they take a bus and a train, and they also take the commuter rail. A lot of our folks work in the North Shore. They rely on the commuter rail as a lifeline. So to say, well, let's just cut on the commuter rail because that's people use that less, that's just not true.
Sure. How do you sort that out? Because you do have these essential workers, whether they take a bus or commuter rail, they have to show up, but there are a lot of other workers who might be working from home, and should the T find a way to sort of scale down to take that into account?
Well, I think one of the things that's really crucial is to really look at who's riding. And not focused entirely on the numbers. Sure, commuter rail ridership is very, very low. However, what that tells us is that the people riding the commuter rail at this point have, for the most part, have no other option, right? Most folks who live out towards the further ends of the commuter, once you get past zone 2 or 3, virtually all of them have cars, with the exception of a good pocket of folks in our gateway cities. But most of the folks out in the suburbs have cars. The vast majority of them, work in offices where they have work from home. And so if you're taking the commuter rail now, chances are, you're a home healthcare aide. Chances are, you perhaps live in a community, like Chelsea or Hyde Park, and you're commuting to a service industry job, out in the suburbs. So, I think it's really, really critical to think about that. And it's also critical to think about, again, the timeline, that you raised earlier, Chris. We're thinking about cuts in July. Obviously, I don't have a crystal ball. A lot of how, we recover from this pandemic in terms of the health side of things depends on, likely, who's in the White House. But, we are, I think most folks are thinking that we will have seen the worst of this by July. And that's exactly when the cuts are going to be coming into effect. So exactly when people are going to feel more comfortable riding the T, exactly when they're going to be going out looking for work. Look, the last time the T had its post-war ridership peak was during the Great Recession. And we think we're headed for something far worse. And so we think this is exactly the wrong time to be cutting service, ahead of what we think is going to be a huge ridership jump, and to be cutting service exactly when folks are going to be trying to take the train again, and when we're going to be trying to start our economic recovery.
Maria, what about fare increases? I'm not so sure that officials are really enthused about raising fares right away, but if they do need to raise fares, what does that mean for the people that you work with, the people who ride buses?
There should be absolutely no fare increases. We have been fighting for a low-income fare. We've been fighting for a reduction of fares so people can afford to get back to work. There should be no whatsoever increase in fares. Fares have gone up at an astronomical rate as compared to, let's say, the gas tax, which we know is very unpopular in Massachusetts. But why are we putting the funding and why are we relying on the riders to fund the MBTA? This should be a public service. It's a public good. This should be funded by the legislature. We should not have to rely on the backs of the riders, the transit dependent, the most low income, the folks that have no other option to pay for the MBTA. There should be absolutely no fare increases.
And to echo and underscore that, the gas tax in the last 20 something years has gone up 15%. Bus fare has gone up 300%.
And who ride the buses?
Right, and primarily low income and people of color. And look, everybody benefits from the T. If you are sailing, if you are, going down a highway that's got, relatively low traffic, you have the T to thank for that, because there could be tens of thousands of people per hour on that corridor were it not for the T.
Maria, what about improvements in service. And there are things that are broken down that need to be fixed. I mean, how does that fit into the equation?
I mean, it comes down to the same, Chris. It comes down to funding, and it comes down to the legislature ensuring that the MBTA has enough money for operational, for capital improvements, for the things that we have to get done. I mean, I can't imagine being in the shoes of folks at the T right now. It is one of the most difficult times they'll experience. And so we're not putting the blame, we're not pointing the finger. We want to work with them because we know they need the funding. The legislature needs to step up and fund for the very same things that you just mentioned. There have to be improvements, operational improvements, capital improvements, things that are breaking down. More buses, we need to electrify our buses so that we have cleaner air. It's not only let's hold on, let's leave service as is, and let's wait a few years. We actually need more revenue, more resources to fund the infrastructure.
Jared, what about the improvement? I mean, because I'm thinking of things like, trains not breaking down or having dedicated bus lanes so it doesn't take forever to get from here to there. I mean, are you worried about those being cut back maybe?
I am. There has been some intention that, even when they're talking about the service cuts, they are still saying that we're, that we're going ahead with, with some of the capital improvements. And I think that, we should definitely not set it up to where the legislature or anybody else says, well, why don't you just cut a bunch from the capital to fix operating or to plug the gaps in the operating budget? And that would be a terrible mistake because, we're talking about things that are going to come into fruition 3 to 5 years down the line. And so we need to be making those investments now. And, look, we as everyone has, been acknowledging that the commute patterns have changed, that we're looking at our, some of our business districts and saying, maybe the best use for this street isn't parking or additional travel lane, but instead it's more space for our businesses. And the same has to be true for our buses. We really need to be looking at all of our corridors, and we need to be looking at how do we move people and not cars, and how do we make sure that the 40 people in a bus, or more than likely in Chelsea, the 65, people on a bus, that they are getting the priority that 65 people deserve, because 65 people can fit in the space of 3 or 4 cars. And yet, time and time again, we put them at the back of the line. And so, this is exactly the time to take that space back, and to say that, what, while traffic is not at its peak, we're going to add more bus lanes. While ridership is a little bit low, we need to make sure that we're really providing really, really, really good mitigation. But that, while ridership is low on certain lines, that we're taking the opportunity to invest in those power systems, to renew the track, all of those things.
And I just want to add that we do applaud the MBTA. Before, pre-COVID, there was a bus lane that was approved in Chelsea, and it was just, it's not finished yet. It was painted red a couple of days ago, and so it is getting implemented. So we do see that as good symbols that the MBTA is working hard and is willing to work with the municipalities. We're hoping that the bus lane will be finished soon, that will move buses faster, and we're still going to fight for a bus lane on the Tobin.
And we could see some more in Boston as well. Thank you both very much for taking the time to be with us.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
Great. That was Jared Johnson from TransitMatters and Maria Belen Power from GreenRoots, Inc. We'll have more news in just a moment.